I don't want to offend anyone by making this video, and I'd like to thank my parents for putting up with my aggressive card game buying habits in advance. This is a cynical pinnacle production. Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic have both existed for almost 20 years or more in different forms over different years and different ways, and neither is superior to the other, or really almost any card game, because fun is subjective, and though some, at least for these two, they are different and yet similar enough that they both warrant the enjoyment that they have earned and respect and dedication. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very different from most card games, as most card games err more on the side of Magic the Gathering. Yu-Gi-Oh! That is because Yu-Gi-Oh! Does not have mana, which is the first thing I wanted to say about this video. In this video, I will talk about things that Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic both separately do well or poorly compared to one or the other. Yu-Gi-Oh! And I'm not going to go in depth into the rules of either game. So hopefully, however, you have played one or the other, so you have a base point to know what I am talking about. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has existed for a while, and it has changed pretty drastically over the years. It was originally a very low power level, slow game that evolved into more mid power, more some strategy, and then, but also a lot of in between gray areas, and then it eventually became a very high power level game, which was both good and bad. And not that early Yu-Gi-Oh! Was not strategic, however, it was very limited in a lot of ways, especially because of FTKs, or first turn kills, or first turn wins, where you win at the game in the first turn of the game, which limited how strategic the game could be, especially considering in the early days of Yu-Gi-Oh! Not much at all could be done to prevent said FTKs, as they'll now be referred to. So that was one limiting factor to Yu-Gi-Oh! However, Magic had some similar issues in the early days, and it also evolved in quite a similar way until it eventually took a back step in the standard format and the modern format, and they decided to lower the power level of the game significantly and come to a more stable point, so to say, whereas Yu-Gi-Oh! Has not. And that is one point I'd like to address about the two games. Competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very volatile, whereas competitive Magic is not so much. In new card sets of Yu-Gi-Oh! They attempt to make cards almost powerful enough that it warrants you needing to buy said new cards to compete at a high level, whereas in Magic it is almost the opposite, because they print new cards, at least in 2020, that are oftentimes so weak that it is ridiculous compared to past cards. However, it's still warranted because the game designers decide to effectively ban previous cards in the formats that are most popular, which is one reason why I personally prefer Commander Magic the Gathering, which allows cards from basically the entire history of the game. Some people don't like that. I respect that. However, I think that I enjoy the game most when there is a high power level allowed, and I will not get into that too much because it has its own advantages and disadvantages. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a very high power level game right now, and by power level I mean the ability when a deck is very competitive, it has a higher power level than other decks. And when all of the cards accumulatively in the game are much, much stronger compared to other games, if they were to have the same or similar rules, then that is when the game has a high power level. Now, Yu Gi Oh! Has many first turn wins, first turn kills, FTKs throughout the years because game designers either did not thoroughly test their cards that they produced, or they simply did not care. Konami, the creators of Yu-Gi-Oh, have claimed in the past that they simply did not test the cards thoroughly enough, which is entirely possible. However, if it is true, Magic the Gathering has done a better job in maintaining a game state where FTKs do not arise. However, they have reached other issues where there is a high power level in and though not impossible to overcome way, nearly impossible, and I will talk about that more. So in standard, people talk about the whole rage in the new format of 2020 is turn 3 Ugin decks, who is a specific deck based around a specific card that is very powerful and comes out very quickly, and it warps the game state because it is very difficult to deal with. Now, Yu Gi Oh! Has had first turn wins decks, first turn kills, which have warped the game in similar ways, and they've also had non FTK decks arise that have also warped the game in similar ways. An example of this is Zodiac, which was a tier 0 deck for a few months and was quite devastating to many competitive players. Now, I have played Yu Gi Oh! Competitively, not to much avail, however. But Magic the Gathering, I've never played very competitively, simply because I was not that good. However, I've played high level power games of Commander Magic the Gathering, so that will be my spiel on that. So, Yu Gi Oh! Is a very engaging game, which I like about it. It is very engaging from the start, unlike most games of Magic, because, especially in modern Yu Gi Oh!, because there are so many things that happen in the first turn that the entire game is engaging rather than the later portion of the game, which is a design ideology that I think Yu Gi Oh! Does better. However, it leads to problematic standpoints where they have created cards which allow for too much of a focus on the early game and not enough on the late game, which have created an imbalance of almost opposite card games despite their many similarities. Whereas Yu Gi Oh! Most games are decided at the start, whereas in Magic, most games are decided at the end as to who will win, so to speak. I like both games. I think they both deserve the recognition they'd receive, and I think they both do interesting things, and here's some more of my input on the subject. So, many people complain who are Magic players would say that Yu-Gi-Oh! They would not even consider Yu-Gi-Oh! As a real card game because they believe it's a children's card game, which may be true that in many ways it is designed for children. However, it is um, very available to high level thinking in many ways because despite one reason which I believe Magic is better in many ways is that it is lacking infinite um, or at least more infinite um, happenings, so to speak. Yu-Gi-Oh still struggles and however with that problem, but still succeeds and exceeds to provide an interesting game. Now, here's my why I think that Yu-Gi-Oh should have more infinite states because for example, if you have not played Yu-Gi-Oh, there are very few infinite combos ever pulled off in a competitive environment, and that is because or at least used in a competitive environment, and that is because they are either extremely difficult to pull off, do virtually nothing to affect the game, or some other reason, or the cards involved are banned for good reason. But Magic has lots of infinite combos, and I think this is interesting, or at least combos involving or conglomerations of cards which provide very high numbers or very complex situations for that exact reason. I believe it makes the game more complex, and Yu-Gi-Oh is difficult to do this because in Yu-Gi-Oh you can have a maximum of absolute maximum of 7 creatures at a time or monsters, and at the very most 5 spells or traps at a time. And obviously you can have at most 60 cards plus the 15 in your extra deck. So you can never reach, the most you can do is have infinite life points either negatively towards your opponent or giving yourself infinite life points. And that is roughly it, or create an infinite game state where some action happens an infinite number of times. But in Magic, there are many more ways where things can become infinite with creatures or almost anything in Magic. And I say this is important because it makes the game more complex. But Yu-Gi-Oh really does succeed in providing an engaging experience because there's always something happening within the game. Even before you've started your first turn in Yu-Gi-Oh, you can do massive things to change the game state. If you discard Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, you can effectively shut down your opponent on their first turn when placed well enough against a weak enough deck. Now, that would almost never happen in a game of Magic, but that is quite common in Yu-Gi-Oh! And in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's very difficult to actually create a time when you have nothing you can do because there are hand traps, many cards which have abilities which can be used at any time to disrupt your opponents, whereas in Magic this is not the case. If your opponent has a way to win turn 1, in most modern formats, such as Modern or Standard, it is highly, highly, highly unlikely you will be able to do anything. Which is part of why Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic are quite different in their interaction because they see turns in a very different way. Yu-Gi-Oh sees turns more as of a construct, whereas Magic views them as more natural. So, and I believe that they are a construct, but that's not important because it's just an idea and it doesn't really matter too much for the actual play of the game because in Yu-Gi-Oh, games can end on the second turn and you can still feel like you had an engaging, worthwhile experience, whereas in Magic, almost never will you end a game on turn two and still feel that way. And this is because Yu Gi Oh! Has a lot more interaction or exchanges of cards and cards' effects in the first few turns of the game compared to Magic. Now, especially in the modern formats. In more lenient formats of Magic like Legacy, Vintage, or Commander, this kind of goes out the window, however, which is one reason why I prefer those types of formats. However, that's not the point of this video. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic could both be improved drastically by taking more of a look at each other in different ways. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a lot of, say, cards where they don't really know what they're doing. For example, they will make cards for an archetype, and then the archetype doesn't really function in competitive play, whereas in Magic, they have cards that can be used in many more ways, and they are much more generic, which is another difference between Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic because Yu-Gi-Oh! Almost every deck is tribal, so to speak, whereas that is not the case in Magic, or archetypal as they would be called in Yu-Gi-Oh! In Yu-Gi-Oh! Almost every deck focuses on a single idea, whereas in Magic, that's not so much the case. Now, it's true that Magic decks focus on single ideas, but not to the degree of Yu-Gi-Oh decks because in Yu-Gi-Oh almost all decks focus on, for example, a single creature type or subtype in Magic, whereas in Magic that's not the case whatsoever. Very few decks do that, which is one excelling point of Yu-Gi-Oh because they have kind of ingrained advantages and disadvantages into different archetypes. Whereas Magic has not done that, which is also an advantage to Magic because you're not as limited to what the designers put out. For example, in Yu Gi Oh! There's a very popular deck at the moment called Salamangreat. Salamangrate's based upon Cybers monsters, and in Magic, the closest thing you'd ever get to that would be blue-white spirits in Modern, for example, where all of the cards synergize and they or slivers in Magic and do things based off each other. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, almost all the decks are similar to Salamangreat in which that they focus on helping each other. And that is an advantage because it guarantees that there's a variety in decks in some ways. If one deck becomes too powerful, that's not true. But in Magic, there's what are called good stuff decks, which are literally decks which are just a conglomeration of cards that are good but don't necessarily have any synergy really, whereas that would never fly in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh! You would lose almost instantaneously. Now, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is quite interesting in that aspect, but most people wouldn't even believe that Yu-Gi-Oh is as complicated or interesting as some people would be led to believe, because if in Yu-Gi-Oh, a lot of people don't even know about the extra deck, so to speak, because in Yu-Gi-Oh, if you've ever played Commander or Magic the Gathering, you know there's the Commander. It's always available to play. In Yu-Gi-Oh, there's 15 of said cards. You have 15 commanders at all given times. Now, admittedly, they're not always used all the time, all of them. However, they're there. You can do it, and they often are used. Now, that is one where I'm going to get onto the crux of this video now. And the main difference between Yu-Gi-Oh and Magic is the lack of mana in Yu-Gi-Oh, which both hinders and helps the game to not only be different but provide an engaging experience. And that is because in Yu-Gi-Oh there is no mana, and instead of managing mana and resources such as the number of cards in hand, the number of cards that are able to do things such as in your graveyard or other field at any given time, in Yu-Gi-Oh is you do not have mana, so you only focus on card advantage, the cards in your hand, field, graveyard, etc. Whereas in Magic you are trying to balance both mana, having enough mana of the right kind, and having the right card advantage that you want. In Yu-Gi-Oh, it's all about card advantage, which is interesting because there's one more element that both games have, which is consistency. Both games are inherently random in many ways because you don't choose what cards you draw at the beginning of the game. They're simply drawn at random. They're shuffled first, the decks, so you do not choose what you get. So there is randomness in the game. And this is seen very often in Yu-Gi-Oh when people claim they have bricked, that they have simply been unable to play this game, because they got incredibly unlucky in their draw. However, in Yu-Gi-Oh, it's all about balancing consistency with card advantage. You want to, in a game of Yu-Gi-Oh, create as much card advantage, as many counter spells, as many negates, as many destruction effects, as many discard. Well, very rarely is Yu-Gi-Oh have discard effects, but if you can, they're nice. And as many protection, as many all of those things, as much damage as possible, as soon as possible, as consistently as possible. That is what makes Yu-Gi-Oh engaging, because, for example, in Yu-Gi-Oh there's a lovely combo of cards which I love, Fluffball Bear and Toy Vendor and Fluffball Wings. Toy Vendor in Yu-Gi-Oh says that while it's on the field, it's basically an enchantment for Magic. And it says once per turn you can discard a card, and if you do, draw a card and discard and reveal the card you drew. If it is a Fluffball creature,